Juniper by Monica Furlong, Chapter 21. In my father's house, the practice was for guests to be shown immediately into his presence, or if that was impossible, to be greeted by an elder and offered refreshment. In the Grey Knight's house, in contrast, we were left standing in the courtyard, tired and dirty. At Castle Door, you were always aware of life going on around you. You could hear chatter, laughter, and singing as people went about their work. At Castle Caerleon, there was an ominous silence that grew as we waited, a silence so oppressive that our conversation fell to a whisper. "Do you think we are being watched?" Finbar asked me quietly. I nodded. Somewhere, I knew, from the stairways and balconies above, eyes were looking coldly down upon us. I shivered. At that moment, a servant appeared and bore away all my possessions to the room I would occupy. He returned shortly to lead the soldiers to the barracks. He tried to shepherd Finbar out with the soldiers, but Finbar stood fast, and I said firmly, "Finbar comes with me." "My lady asked only for you," the servant said nervously, "and I will not go without Finbar. I will explain it to your lady." Marut was sitting in a huge chair on a dais in the middle of a long room, which gave her the appearance of a queen awaiting her subjects. Herbs were strewn on the floor, scenting the room. The great black hound sat at her feet, watching us alertly. Marut was dressed in a silk gown of brilliant red. At her neck was a chain with flashing stones. I advanced several steps into the room, very conscious that she was studying me. She knew, I was sure, that I had the protection of my Doran's cloak, and probably also that my skin had been bathed with clear water. Then, as if she had only just noticed me, she rose to her feet with a small cry of simulated delight. She held out her arms to me, kissed me, and drew me to a seat beside her grand chair. It was placed lower, I noticed, on a step. "You remember Gamal's friend Finbar," I said. Marut gave him a bleak stare. "I had hoped that we might speak alone," she replied. "There is nothing that Finbar may not hear," I said. "He is my father's messenger." Marut hesitated, and then, plainly not wishing to cross me so early in our meeting, said, "Very well." "We were kept waiting by your servants," I said, "and we need to wash after our journey." Later, she said indifferently. There was a pause, and again I had the unpleasant sensation of being watched. I looked around the room. Hanging tapestries might conceal a watcher. A door at the far end of the room was ajar, too. "Where is Gamal?" I asked in a loud voice. By all means, let any eavesdropper hear the conversation. "He is unwell," Marut said. I stared at her. My expression showed plainly enough that I knew this statement to be a lie. "What ails him?" I asked. "He has a rash and a fever," she replied. "He is not well enough to see you." "Perhaps I could help. I am trained in healing." A look of contempt crossed Marut's face. "I have no doubt that you know all the old wives have to teach." I controlled my temper, remembering the need to find a way to help Gamal. "You know that Gamal's choice of you, Ninnock, has brought great joy to the Grey Knight and me. As my brother's daughter, you were always dear to me, and now we shall move into a closer friendship, to which I look forward with happiness." "And Gamal, what does he feel?" "How can you ask? You know that he has always adored you." "We have been friends." Her eyes flickered hypnotically. She had an oddly snake-like quality, I thought. You will wish to see your room. It is what we call the Eastern apartment. Finbar will have a room in the barracks. Finbar, I said, is a part of my retinue and must have a room near me. My father was concerned about my taking so long a journey virtually alone, and I promised him that Finbar would be my bodyguard and stay always within earshot. Marut's eyes flickered again. You think yourself in danger in the Grey Knight's house? There are dangers everywhere. When I was a girl, Marut said icily, such an arrangement would have caused unpleasant gossip. My honor and Finbar's, I said, are beyond doubt, and I am still a child. I am surprised at you, Aunt Marut. Finbar had listened to this exchange with his habitual look of faint amusement, but he flashed an admiring glance at me when it became clear that I had won the argument. I was very relieved to know he would be close at hand in that sinister castle. The two of us went with Marut to the eastern apartment. It was large and sunlit, with a big silk-hung bed. There were fine tapestries of gods and goddesses. In the one opposite the bed, a goddess who seemed to be the spirit of spring was strewing flowers over a barren winter landscape. A servant had unpacked my baggage, and everything was stored neatly away. I lifted Moon out of the bag I was carrying and set him, sleepy as ever, on a beam. I noticed a door set in one of the walls and asked for it to be opened. I sensed the servant's reluctance and thought I could detect the sound of movement in the next room. Finally, Marut nodded. The door, I saw, opened into a small, bare chamber in which there would be room to place a bed for Finbar. There was a clean patch in the dust on the floor, as if a chair had been set close to the door of my chamber and then removed. My guess was that someone had been preparing to spy. Finally, Marut went away with her servants, leaving me alone with Finbar. We looked searchingly at each other, but knew better than to speak our thoughts. I need to wash and rest, I said, and so do you. But I would like to see the environs of Caerleon before dark. Later we will ride together. Finbar nodded and went out. When we did meet, there was something I needed to report to him immediately. They took the clear water, I told him. I questioned the servant and she swore that the flasks were not in the baggage. That leaves us unprotected. Finbar's face was grave. He no longer thought the clear water a foolish notion. Not at all, I said. Look, and I produced a flask from under my cloak. I brought one for each of us just to be sure. Use it carefully. With the rest of the retinue, we attended the formal dinner that Marut gave in welcome that night. I had taken pains with my appearance and was slightly dismayed when, just before I went to the hall, Moon clambered up my arm and sat firmly on my shoulder. I lifted him off gently, saying, "No, Moon," but he returned imperturbably, and I knew that he meant to accompany me. I must have looked very odd when I entered the hall, but when I sat down, Moon hopped on the floor and dozed off again under my chair. I sat beside the Grey Knight. He was beautifully dressed in velvet and fur and scented with a sweet, rich oil. Did that scent conceal some other, less pleasant odor? I suspected it did. As I soon discovered from his conversation, the knight was well educated and had studied the astronomical wisdom of the ancients at length. He was also very courteous, and I must say I was charmed by him. He had huge, dark eyes that I found very attractive. Every time I looked into them, they reminded me of someone, though I could not think of who it was. I retired for the night more than a little under his spell. The next morning, Finbar and I were taken to see the Grey Knight's soldiers practicing on a nearby field. I was appalled by their number. They were a small army, and I knew that I was intended to be impressed by this display of might. 3 days passed. Marut said more than once that it was a pity Gamal was too ill to meet me on this visit. There was nothing, however, to prevent us from making all the necessary plans for the wedding, though Gamal and I might not meet again until the actual day of the ceremony. I did not know where Gamal's chamber was, closely as I watched the servants for clues, but I did know that Marut and the Grey Knight had their private rooms in the western wing of the castle. So it was that I formed the desperate plan of visiting Marut's rooms in her absence to see whether I could find Gamal or simply discover some secret about Marut, I knew not what, that would help save him. Every afternoon, I observed, Marut and the Grey Knight rode out together, yet I knew that her servants might be at work in her absence. After the midday meal, I pleaded a headache and a need to rest and went to my room. Later, knowing that Marut would have left, I put on my Doran's cloak, and with my heart beating quite fast, I went to the western wing. Marut had a suite of rooms, and in the first of them her fat servant was asleep upon a daybed, snoring loudly. I slid silently past her into another room. This was a day room, comfortably appointed, and through an open door on the far side of it I could see Marut's sleeping chamber. Inside there was nothing of interest except a troubling smell. Partly it was the smell of Marut's dog. I was surprised that she allowed such a large dog in her room, and also that its smell lingered even in its absence, though I was relieved that she had not left it behind to guard her quarters. Yet beyond the dog's smell there was another smell that I half recognized but could not place. There was no time to think about it, however. When I opened a door on the far side of the chamber, I found myself in a workroom full of flasks and jars. A cock in a crate on the floor began to protest at the sight of me. I recognized many herbs whose uses I knew well, but everything was placed tidily on a shelf, and there was nothing to indicate which jars were in use. Marut's leather stick stood against the wall, and I picked it up and examined it with interest. It had the look and feel of a magical object, but I could not imagine what Marut used it for. Yet another door opened out of this room, and without much hope of finding further clues about Marut, I opened it. For a wild moment, I simply could not take in what I saw, it was so extraordinary. For there, sitting up in bed and staring straight at me, wild-eyed, was Gamal. Not only did his face show no sign of recognition of me, but he seemed unaware that anyone had come into the room. I went to the bed and took his hand. "Gamal, it is I, Ninuk. Do you remember?" But as if he were deaf, blind, and without feeling, Gamal continued to stare straight ahead. I squeezed his hand, touched his white face, talked to him, but I might as well have talked to a chair. Yet I could feel that his hand trembled, see that he was sweating, smell the odor of foreboding that his body gave off. I longed to stay with him, but I knew that I could not risk it. Quietly, I slid out of his room and began the journey back through Marut's rooms toward the corridor and safety. I had gotten as far as Marut's sleeping chamber when, to my horror, I heard Marut loudly scolding her servant. I could not escape. I was so frightened when I heard Marut's voice coming closer that at first I could not move. Then very quickly I began to retreat toward Gamal's room. There, without thinking about it, I crawled under the bed. I was well hidden by the draperies of the bed, but I was shaking with terror at the thought of being caught. I had no idea why she had returned early from her ride, but I feared that somehow she had guessed what I had done. She came into the room so quietly that at first I was not even sure she was there. I scarcely dared to breathe as I waited for her to lift the draperies and expose me. Then I heard her walk across the room and pour something into a goblet. She walked back to the bed, and it sounded as if she was giving Gamal a drink. There was a clink as she put the goblet down, then a long silence. After an interminable wait, Marut, to my horror, said, "You can come out from under the bed, Ninuk." Red-faced, I crawled out, saying the first thing that came into my head. I thought perhaps I could help Gamal, being a healer. Marut looked at me with a mixture of amused contempt and anger that made me feel not at all like a Doran, but like a very silly little girl. "If we need your help, Ninok, we shall ask for it. In the meantime, I shall let your father know about your appalling manners and suggest that he teach you the rudiments of what it means to be a guest. Since you have forfeited that right, I shall treat you as what you are, a naughty child. Go to your room. We shall not expect to see you at the table until tomorrow." I went to my room, fuming at Marut's speech. Yet despite my anger, I knew that there was something much more important at stake than my hurt feelings. I could not forget Gamal's staring eyes and blank white face.